was, I think almost everybody knows, Ms. Bobbie Raymond, Bobbie Roberta Raymond-Larson, was the person who, the founder and the longtime director for the Oak Park Housing Center. She is the person who's put this panel together and will lead the discussion with them and introduce them for the rest of the afternoon. So let's welcome our panel members.
Well, I want to thank Debbie. I think this is just a marvelous effort that the library put this series together, because we have to, I believe, constantly revisit this issue and constantly rededicate ourselves to an open and diverse community. But we do have a wonderful, wonderful panel, and I think you will really enjoy hearing from the people on this panel and their different perspectives, because they really bring a richness to the discussion today. And I have no idea what they're going to say. This is going to be a really freewheeling discussion for about an hour, and then we will open it to questions and comments from the audience. And let me say, looking out at the audience, almost everybody in the audience should be up here on stage with us, because almost all of you have a really rich background in Oak Park, and you've all been leaders, in a sense, in this community. And probably one of the things we should have done, and maybe Debbie the next time will do this, is say that everybody who's over 50 or 60 has to bring a 20-year-old with them to an event like this, because really, because I mean, just looking around, and we commented about this up on stage, and that is, you know, where are the young people that we really need to educate about this? And I think the real value in having this on video, and I really want to thank our village manager, Kara Pavlicek, because she offered to have this done today, to put it on video and to make it available to the public. And this just happened really in the last couple of days, and so I'm very appreciative that Kara offered to do this. And so anyway, let me introduce the panelists, and we're going to open with, I think, a very important question. Louise Varnes on my far right. We just checked on how long Louise has been involved at the Oak Park Regional Housing Center. She was one of our original volunteers in 1973 and stayed on to become a housing counselor, and she is still there. She has outlived me on the staff by about 18 years, and every day she is dealing with the issues that are just so critical to this community in terms of counseling people about making a move to Oak Park. And this is primarily rentals that we're talking about. And so Louise is going to be a really important resource here today. She's been involved as a volunteer with many organizations in Oak Park, and I think you will really enjoy hearing from her. And then next we have Larry Christmas. Incidentally, we're just going to call each other by first names up here. Larry Christmas, many of you know, as the former village president of Oak Park. But when he came on the village board, he was the executive director of NIPSI, the Northeastern Illinois Planning Commission. And so what he really brought to this village, and I think is very symbolic and indicative of so many of our trustees in the village of Oak Park and our village presidents, is they come to us with a lot of knowledge, and we are able to, almost free of charge, tap into that knowledge. And so Larry really brought an amazing background to his time on the village board. And he is still living in Oak Park. He is still active in the community, and I am personally really waiting to hear from Larry. And last, Ronald Atkins. Ron served on the Housing Center board for many years, and he brought a lot of information to us about his own experiences in looking for housing in Oak Park, plus sort of the economic view of integration, diversity. Ron is a banker. He now lives in River Forest. He served on the District 90 school board. He has been active in many activities since he moved to River Forest. He was a great board member on the Housing Center board, and I think, again, Ron will give you some very interesting comments in the discussion. So what I really want to open with, I think, is like the big question. Many of you were here in the 60s and 70s, and you know there was a huge challenge to Oak Park in terms of achieving long-term racial diversity. And often for people who are not from the Chicago area, there is this question like, well, what's the big issue? You know, why was it so, why did people expect that Oak Park could not achieve long-term racial diversity? Why was this? What were the challenges? What had happened in Chicago to set this pattern, this very negative pattern of looking, as Sal Alinsky said, at integration being that brief period of time when the first black family moved into a neighborhood and the last white family moved out of the neighborhood. And that is a statement, I think, that a lot of people had in their minds about Oak Park and many other communities in the Chicago area. So I'm just gonna turn to Larry and pop that one, and then we can all join in on this question, this important question.
Thank you, Bobbie. Well, I'm having to think way back, 40 years ago in my case, to when I became involved at all, and I can't claim to be any more than an official observer at that point. It was actually when a village trustee by the name of Varnes made a proposal that there should be a quota ordinance in Oak Park limiting black occupancy in the village as the way to achieve stable racial diversity. And this caused an uproar. Not only were there the questions of its ethics and morality and legality, it was essentially saying that at least one trustee doubted that all the programs that were then in effect were going to be effective. That in his opinion, it seemed there was the feeling that something more had to be done to prevent the resegregation of Oak Park, and he proposed the quota system. A group of us, people in the not-for-profit sector in Chicago area, working for organizations that were housing advocates, fair housing advocates, got together and offered to the village a deal that it couldn't resist.
Sorry.
I think
There you go.
Yeah. It was,
Sorry,
Did you hear anything I said? I don't have to say it over again. Okay, so a group of us in the not-for-profit sector, in and outside of the village, got together and made an offer to the village that it couldn't refuse. We offered for $1 a contract of services that we would provide that would help look again at what the village was doing and what it might be doing in order to achieve its purpose. I think today that would be $3 with inflation. And with one exception, one trustee thought it wasn't a good bargain, but the rest took it on. And so we initiated what is known as a Delphi process. This is a group decision-making process developed by the Rand Corporation, which allows for an assortment of people to get together and decide a question without the problems of personality, status, face-to-face confrontation, and in-and-out decision-making. It's a process that the Rand Corporation developed to allow groups to answer questions that were difficult to deal with if you didn't get away from the personality issues. It involved anonymity. All the people participating were unknown to each other, at least what they offered in the process was unknown, their authorship was unknown. So nobody could sort of throw their title on the table and say, I speak as the ultimate authority on a given topic. And it involved several rounds of questionnaires. And it took a year and a half actually to do. But I want to impress you with the people involved, included at least two people I see in the room. The lady sitting next to me, and I see Gail and Gockel here. They were part of a 20-member core group that more or less directed the project. There were 100 additional citizens chosen by the village board that were involved. And then I think very importantly, there was what we called a regional group. And let me try to impress you with the membership of that regional group that was looking over our shoulder and participating with us and either agreeing or disagreeing with what the village was doing. The 10 members, all but one, fully participated in the process. I forget which is the one who dropped out. And John Baird of Baird and Warner just passed away here a month or two ago, age 98. A very important figure in the housing and real estate world. Harry Gottlieb, who was then the executive director of the Regional Housing Coalition, he was also deputy director of the Leadership Council for Metropolitan Open Communities. That was the group established after the agreement between Mayor Daley and Martin Luther King to deal with the issues of housing segregation. Doug Kramer, president of Draper and Kramer, his father, Ferd Kramer, was a national authority on housing diversity, integration, and so forth. You may remember Lake Shores and Prairie Shores and Lake Meadows in Chicago, which were integrated through a management process. He was a pioneer in that field. John McKnight, professor at Northwestern University. Alex Polikoff, the famous attorney who won the case against Chicago Housing Authority before the U.S. Supreme Court, the so-called Gautreaux case. Stephen Pollack, attorney for Shea and Gardner. Lee Schwartz, then Corporation Counsel for the City of Chicago. Charles Spivey, Executive Director of the Church Federation. Bernie Weisbord, President, Metropolitan Structures. And Cale Williams, the Director of the Leadership Council for Metropolitan Communities. These are the folks that were joining with us locally in determining what were the right things to do, what would be effective and what not. Interestingly, at the outset, we defined what we thought we should be trying to achieve in terms of racial diversity, and came up with a definition which had largely centered on the notion of equal demand for housing in all parts of the village, equal demand between whites and blacks, so that you didn't have an unbalanced demand situation. And then they were also asked as to how they felt about the likelihood of achieving that goal. Interesting to me was that at the outset, on a scale of 1 to 10, our 120 local participants gave an average score of 8 on a scale of 1 to 10 of likelihood of achieving our objective. Our regional people gave an initial judgment of about a 5 on a scale of 1 to 10. They were rather dubious, but by the time the process ended, they raised their score to 7. So they were becoming more optimistic with us locally that it could be achieved. Okay, so what happened? They looked at all the programs the village had then established, the Fair Housing Ordinance, housing counseling, all the programs that we'll be hearing about today, and they judged all of them to be worthwhile and useful. The only thing that they all disagreed with, that is they all opposed, was the quota ordinance. Sorry, Mr. Varnes. And so there was unanimity really on what should be tried in order to achieve our purpose. The results, I think, were encouraging to everybody, including the village board. It suggested that we were on the right track, that if we could be successful, this was the way to do it. And so it gave us all a shot of confidence that we were starting right. Now, flash forward 20 years. By this time, I'm on the village board, and I'm looking around and expecting to have conversations on the question of what do we do next and how are we doing with our racial diversity objective. And I was disappointed to find that there was little interest in the subject. It almost never came up in any village board deliberations except in one context. There was an opposition on my board to the continued full funding of the Housing Center, the Residence Corporation, the Oak Park Development Corporation, the 3 organizations that had up to that point been considered very much favored organizations in town, and so a sizable portion of the community development block grant monies were allocated to those 3 groups. Well, I had 3 trustees who, for various reasons, didn't think that was still necessary or desirable. They didn't want to stop funding, but they wanted to reduce funding. And so we had a public debate, and by a vote of 4 to 3, we continued full funding of these 3 organizations. But that was the only time the issue really surfaced publicly. I found that it was hard for me as village president to even figure out what was going on. The record keeping, the statistics, etc., were hard to find. You could look at school enrollments to see how diversity was working or not working, but other than that, there really wasn't much information. Of course, one problem was that a lot of our apartment buildings were being converted to condominium, and this meant that the village was no longer in the easy position of evaluating units before they changed hands to see how well they were being managed, etc. And so this somewhat affected our ability to monitor progress. But it was apparent too that the village was gradually integrating, and so it appeared that it was on the right track, whatever the shortcomings might be of the procedures and implementation efforts. And so it was not perceived by anybody to be a crisis. But at the same time, I and some others felt that this whole purpose of maintaining a stable racially diverse community was going to be a continuing challenge. It wasn't something that was going to be solved and we could all go home. We had to keep after it. And it seemed to me at least that that attitude was not so apparent anymore, that it seemed to be off the table and other things were of more interest to folks. And so I was concerned. Now we get to the present day, 20 years after that, and I see that we are having to start the dialogue again. That's a good thing. We're going to have to see what happens next. But by and large, I'm sort of proud of our past record, but I'm concerned that we may not be adequately keeping this issue on the agenda of the community as a whole, not just the village board. The Housing Center, of course, is still strong and doing excellent work, and we're proud of that. But I don't think we can just rely on the Housing Center alone to solve everything. So let me stop there.
Yeah, I'm going to turn to Louise and then to Ron, because I think they bring us that day-to-day kind of experience, because not so much Ron day-to-day now, but I think looking back at what he experienced in moving into Oak Park and then to River Forest. But Louise is on the front line. And so what do you think, Louise, when we started out and even today, these expectations, the challenges are to long-term diversity?
Well, I think they're essentially the same today as they were. There's still a great number of people who come into our office and already have a very decided idea of where they feel they would be willing to move based on a variety of questions, but some of them being safety or the feeling that they would be in a compatible kind of a neighborhood. And some of them step off a plane and the first thing they do is come to see us. They just come right from the airport and they are already armed with that idea that they know where they ought to be. And who knows where they get all this information.
So if I walked into the Housing Center today from Cleveland, and what would you say to me? I mean, what would you do in terms of telling me about Oak Park and policies here, or how would that be handled today?
Well, first of all, everyone who comes into the office is immediately handed a lot of literature that tells about them. But basically, the first idea is that they're supposed to read our policy. And that states very clearly to them that we're based on working for diversity and that the listings are going to be given to them on that basis. And we're going to help them to look throughout the community. And when we sit down with an individual and try to get to the basis of the requirements that they have, we're going to offer them listings that are in their the price that they want, the date that they want, the size, etc., all those kinds of requirements. But we're going to offer them as much choice as we can throughout the community based on our policy of working for diversity. That's made clear to them before that, and then we proceed to give them the listings. That's what we've always done from day one. And then when we try to address the issue of whether or not they will actually follow through, be interested enough to go and look at places, we try to find out what their objections would be based on, if they have stated objections, and let them know that the staff in the Housing Center, we represent all different parts of the community, and many of us, having lived here for a long time, have a great deal of experience. We love our community, and we feel very happy about referring them to any part of town where the listing fits what they are looking for. And then we also will help them by taking them there sometimes, where we have that arrangement with an owner. and we get people out. We talk about all the advantages that are available in different parts of town and how much we like our community, but stress that it's their choice. No one has to move in any particular place. We're making the offer. We're going to show them, give them information about fine apartments in the community in different areas, and help them to see them, and continue to give them listings until they find what they would like. But it's all done on an individual basis, and a client comes in and sits down with an individual advisor and talks it over, but we don't use any heavy duty kind of tactics to get somebody to go to one place or another. We give them the information, we talk it out, and keep giving them leads until they find something, if indeed they do.
We're going to get back to this one because this is such an important part of the housing center. I want to throw in one very brief comment before we turn to Ron Atkins, and that is that the challenge that we faced in 72, and I think it's been pointed out already, is not terribly different from what we're hearing today. And what we really see as we look around the United States, and we'll talk a little bit later about the Oak Park Exchange Congress, but through the Exchange Congress, which was a series of meetings held on an annual basis, we were able to meet with people from around the United States. So we weren't just dealing, in a vacuum with just Oak Park. We were talking to Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights and all of these other communities from around the country. And unfortunately, and I was just reading some material even last night at about 11 o'clock, statistically, all of these communities seem to be in the process of slow, what we call resegregation from all white to all black. But, the rate of change for some of these communities has been very, very slow, and it has allowed them to maintain a strong economic climate and a strong real estate market. And so as we discuss this issue, we're not just looking at the rate of change in a community, we're not just looking at the extent of change in a community, all of these different factors, how long have we been at this? And when you start looking at us and look at Shaker Heights and look at some of these other communities, now 50 years of working on diversity, I think that makes a very strong statement. And yet that challenge, that expectation that we're not going to succeed is always sort of looming there. That expectation that this is a tough battle, a tough thing to achieve, is always there in the background. And so I'm going to pass this over to Ron, and I think Ron also, in our discussion, was talking about some economic factors, so go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. I became involved in the Housing Center probably in the early 80s, maybe like 83 or something like that. Just after I moved here in, I think, 82 from Chicago. I was living on the north side, and I'm from Indianapolis. So I was looking for a community that I could get around, that had parks, that had good schools and those kinds of things, and ended up going through the housing search process, and eventually kind of got steered to a house over on Humphrey that was within our budget. But I definitely felt like, unlike Louise describes, I did feel like it was a little bit of a heavy hand as to how I ended up there.
Is that from a realtor? Or
yeah, from a realtor.
Yeah.
Definitely a heavy hand, and during that process, something that came sort of flashed back into my mind that I had really kind of buried back when I was probably in the 7th grade. My mom was looking to buy a house in Indianapolis, and when we went out to search, we'd actually gotten the door slammed in our face. And so, just bam, slammed in your face. And so I kind of thought, I've kind of been through a little subtle process, but it's not a lot different at the end of the day than that process. And got involved with the housing center as a volunteer, board member, and met some of the audience members out there, David Bollinger and Nina, and really began to appreciate the difference in the inside view of the community versus the outside view of the community. So when I was moving from Chicago, schools, check. Parks all around, check. Good crime statistics, check. Rail transit into the city, because I worked in the Loop, check. Close to the airports for travel, check. So a lot of checks. Then when I got involved in the community, met Louise, whoa, you have to work to make this happen. This didn't just happen. Learned a little bit more about Shaker Heights and kind of saw the other side of what can happen on a larger basis. You were starting to see and did see some other communities that things didn't go so smoothly. And as a banker as well, and the son of teachers and a family of teachers, our schools here are, excellent schools. We've got an excellent private school, well known, but the public schools here really are very, very good. The community has poured a lot of money and a lot of resources into them in terms of their own volunteer times, in terms of their own intellect. And, I guess I believe that at the end of the day, for your future, that sets you apart. It sets you apart in the people that you grow that become adults. It sets you apart in the demand for your housing stock from an economic standpoint. Young families will do their research. Google makes it easier. They'll find out where the good schools are. They'll find out, what the tax rates are, what the proximity to transportation. So I didn't want to see that change, and I wanted to see that continue to change or deteriorate. This is what I should say. I wanted to see that continue to improve and continue to be a magnet. And living on Humphrey, I didn't have a good sense of Austin when I moved here, because I'm not from Chicago and I was pretty young. So Austin didn't have a particular connotation to me. But as I lived here and the years went on, it did become a connotation to me, even though we had the garden walk and things like that. Because I lived here, I had a certain positive connotation of it. Well, when I went to sell my house, then I saw the other part of discrimination. We used to have a joke at the housing center. There are people who want to live, west of Oak Park Avenue. They come, like Louise says, off the plane, and I got to live west of Oak Park Avenue because that other stuff over there I can't deal with. And then you have people that they want to live west of Harlem.
Yes.
That's the punchline. But that's a real fear that drives decision making and will change the complexion of the community if you aren't taking concrete steps to really intervene and really present the community in really all of its glory and what can be our best. My final comment on this is to Larry's point about re-engaging the discussion. I'm a sports fan, and you would think that in the NFL, in today's age, when you have integrated teams, you have black quarterbacks, you have black coaches, you have black general managers, you wouldn't have a situation that like you have in Miami now. And if those of you who don't know, there's a tremendously incendiary report that came out yesterday on the bullying situation of a group of players against other individuals, players and employees on that team. So my link to the housing center is, no matter what you may think from afar, the inside story does require constant maintenance, constant investment to really get the ideals, the results, and the practices that you want. So that's my thoughts.
Well, this gives us a great segue when Ron talks about the door slamming in his parents' faces. I think it's appropriate now to go back in time to the 60s and bring you up to date on how we got to where we are today. In the mid-60s, an organization called the Oak Park River Forest Citizens Committee for Human Rights was formed to work for equal opportunity housing in Oak Park. And this was based on, I don't want to get into the long story, but it was based on a black female musician who had joined the Oak Park Symphony and problems that developed therein. And what happened then was a group of people in Oak Park were very upset about that and joined together and formed the Citizens Committee and then started looking at issues like housing. Now, it's kind of interesting because Oak Park had black residents probably as early as 1870s, 1880s, and that history was lost to most people until, well, I'll tell you later about that a little bit, but some research that we did in the 70s. But, so there had been black residents in Oak Park. Percy Julian was not the first black to move to Oak Park. And that had been throughout the community. In fact, the concentrations of black residents had been mostly in northwest Oak Park, not in southeast Oak Park. But this organization was formed, and when I moved back to Oak Park from New York City, I had lived in a diverse neighborhood in New York City, and I saw in the newspaper that this organization was meeting at Third Unitarian Church in Austin, and I went to the meeting, and that was a meeting that changed my life. I met Lee Brook, who was sitting in the audience, and he was the housing chairman, and what that meant was that he was the guy who would arrange for black families to come to Oak Park and look for housing at a time when there was no fair housing ordinance and when the door was almost always slammed in the faces of blacks seeking housing through realtors or rental agents. So anyway, I joined this group, and then Lee said, no, I've got all these things I have to do, and Bobbie, would you take over as housing chairperson? And I did. And it was a revelation to me because we literally, I would accompany black families looking for rental housing or purchase housing in Oak Park, and we would walk up the stairs, and I can remember so many of these instances, and in fact, there are still families living here today who experience this. We would walk up the stairs, and it would be an open house advertised in the newspaper by realtors, and I was with the black family, and the guy met us at the top of the stairs, who was the real estate agent, and he said, I'm sorry, I can't show you the house because it's not an M listing. And I said, you know, we'd like to see the house. And sometimes we would even try to push past and take a look at the house. And in this one case, the family that was looking said, oh no, we don't like this house, it's too small, you know. So it was kind of a nice little comment there. It wasn't good enough, and they actually about a year later found a much nicer house, and they were able to buy it, and everything worked out great at that point. But the fact is that housing was closed, and so we worked very, very hard until 1968. And it's a story that, of course, if you want to read more about it, there's a lot of material about what happened with the fair housing marches in Oak Park, and the work that we did on a daily basis to inform the village government about the advantages of diversity. And by this time, we had made contact with many other communities in the United States through groups like National Neighbors. Galen Gockel, sitting in the audience, he had written a book on racial integration in American neighborhoods. There was a lot being written about this topic. much more than is being written today on the topic, I might say. And so finally, to get to the end of this rather, I thought, exciting story, being involved with it, hearings were held in Oak Park with the Community Relations Commission and finally with the village trustees, in which hundreds of people turned out to speak in favor of fair housing. And many people turned out to speak in opposition to fair housing. And I have to say that at that time, there were really no realtors who spoke in favor of fair housing. And we've seen a complete change today in realtors who do speak in favor of fair housing. So, you know, I sit here and I kind of look around and I say, we all did it. What we accomplished was amazing. But there are a lot of stories in terms of how we accomplished this, and we have about 25 minutes to cover them. But I just wanted to bring you up to date on the passage of the ordinance and on what happened immediately after the passage of the ordinance. So, okay, all these people are speaking, there are threats, people are being called at home, their lives are being threatened, my life was being threatened, a lot of people's lives were being threatened. But somehow we prevailed, and the village government did the right thing. Against all odds, they voted in favor of the Fair Housing Ordinance. Meanwhile, of course, the national scene was getting quite heated, and so we were passing a national fair housing law. And also we were beginning to see, you know, a very volatile but very exciting civil rights movement taking place in this country, and many of us became involved with Dr. Martin Luther King and other fair housing advocates in the city. And Larry mentioned the Leadership Council for Metropolitan Open Communities, Home Investments Funds. Some of these organizations we joined, and Oak Parkers became leaders in these organizations working for area-wide fair housing. And so a lot of wonderful things were happening. What set Oak Park apart from many other communities in the United States was that the minute the Fair Housing Ordinance passed in Oak Park, we had enforcement. There were people at Village Hall who took housing complaints as they were filed, discrimination complaints, and we were able to resolve them. But many people were talking about what could be done. And I turned to Lee, and I sort of look at Lee as being the person who started me on this road to go back to school. I went to graduate school, and I wrote my thesis on Oak Park and the chances for successful integration here. And as a result of writing the thesis, I was called upon to speak to many organizations in Oak Park. And one of my suggestions, I reread my thesis, parts of it last night. I always enjoy reading. I mean, it's sort of weird. It's almost like I'm reading something somebody else wrote, but it's kind of fun to go back and see what you thought, 50 years ago, 40, 50 years ago, because I don't think too differently today, I guess. But anyway, going back and reading it, one of the suggestions was for some kind of housing action center. And we went to the village government and we said, we'd like to do something, have some kind of a center where people who are looking for housing could find out this is not just any other old, kind of suburb. This is a place that really has a mission, a goal, and its diversity for the long haul, not just for 6 months or a year. And so they asked me if I would take this on for 3 years, and I agreed to do it with a bunch of volunteers like Louise and about 30, 40 other women who came and said, I'd like to volunteer, and that kicked off the housing center. But, it was, housing discrimination was not only rampant, but what we were beginning to see, and I want to talk about that a little bit in the group, was the neglect of rental housing in the community. And so when you look today at the apartment buildings, and you look at how beautiful most of our buildings are today, with especially the courtyard buildings, with the intercoms and, the beautifully landscaped areas, the new kitchens, the new bathrooms, none of that existed in 1972 when the housing center opened its doors right next door, that way, right next door at the, what is now the First United Church, which was First Congregational Church. And so, you know, we looked at the housing stock and we said, and this is when the housing center first started, wow, this is like, you know, those of us who live in houses, we didn't realize how bad many of these apartment buildings were. And so the housing center and the village embarked on a wide variety of programs to upgrade the housing stock. And so that's enough from me, but I think it was important to give you a little bit of background to how the housing center got started. And then everybody else, I think, has some ideas about what we did and how we've continued to work on improving the housing stock. And I'd certainly like to start with Louise on that.
Well, one of the things that occurred to me when I began thinking about this for this afternoon was that the fact that you had a certain amount of funding, but not a lot of money to go on, and needed all those volunteers, I think worked wonders, because you had 20 or more different people coming in and seeing from the inside what this organization was all about. It wasn't a mysterious office that was staffed by a couple of people serving the public, but the public in Oak Park was learning through the people working there and spreading that word around to their family and friends of how people were being treated and what was being done there, and built a great deal of support in the community. And then, of course, that did leave the dollars more to be able to operate in a different way. But from the beginning, it was a very, very open process.
I think we spent $12,000. Our budget was $12,000 the first year, and they were all volunteers, and I finally was earning 30 cents an hour, so it gives you a little sense of how we were budgeted.
There's a case for minimum wage.
Yeah, right. But Louise, what about like the clients coming back and complaining about the quality of the housing, what you saw in terms of the improvement of the housing?
That's been so dramatic, because now people come in and they all want very fancy kitchens and improvements, which you find in condos, you know, and more of the owners are doing that, and that the stock is so much better. And now that we have so many people who are taking the clients around to see apartments, and our staff members who work directly with the owners have so much to tell us about what the apartments are like when we provide the information to the clients themselves, and we get around to look at them. So that has been a very great improvement, certainly, and gives you confidence when you're giving the information to people, that you're sending them to a nice place. And you also know other people who've moved there, that you've worked with, buildings that have resident managers that we will continue to have a relationship with. So, and we know people in all the different neighborhoods, people who are connected with the housing center, our friends and neighbors. So there's a lot of information for us to dispense to people with great confidence. It feels really good to giving them a good deal, something. Get out there and look at it. You're going to love it. And make up your mind based on some real information, not an idea that someone has put in your head that you wouldn't like it over there. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that the village not only passed bond issues for improvement of apartment buildings, but that our Residents Corporation Housing Authority were they were really pioneers in taking some of these 1920s buildings and bringing them up to code, because many of them were not meeting housing code, and going beyond housing code. Larry, what do you think? I mean, when you were on the village board, a lot of money was being spent on improving apartment buildings in Oak Park. How do you think the board dealt with that, and how did you feel about spending money on existing buildings in Oak Park? A lot of people didn't think it was a good idea.
Well, there was some dissension on our board. I remember at least one trustee who was very concerned about practice of the Residence Corporation buying a building that was in trouble, reintegrating it, fixing it up, etc., and then not putting it back on the market again. The Residence Corporation said, well, when we've done that before, we've found that often they got resegregated a second time. Well, the question then came, should the Residence Corporation keep owning buildings indefinitely? So that was a dispute. Nobody was really raising the question of how much money to spend on building improvements, but there was this general attitude that this is not a topic that we're really focusing on now, that we have other issues. I'd like to segue, if I could, into a kind of a regional summary of what's going on during this period. Put on my regional hat. As many of you probably know, there is no more a Leadership Council for Metropolitan Open Communities. John Luckhart, recently deceased, was the last president of that organization. And I think their demise sort of indicates that in general, society is turning to other subjects and away from questions of fair housing and civil rights and integration or non-integration. And I think, in fact, the situation is not really gone away. In fact, communities like Oak Park still find themselves as somewhat isolated in the sense that there are still too few communities that are known to be open and friendly to racial diversity. And so a lot of people are steered or self-steer themselves to these few communities. It's true that the regional strategies were somewhat effective. My regional group, for example, in looking at all the different options, did put an emphasis on more regional strategies, such as trying to promote open housing everywhere, not just in a handful of towns. Nipsey, where I worked, had a program where we had the opportunity to review federal grant applications from local municipalities, and if they had a bad record on fair housing, we would encourage them strongly to adopt a fair housing ordinance, or we would not comment favorably on their federal grant application, and that, I think, had some effect. I don't know whether Nipsey's successor organization, CMAP, does the same sort of thing. In other words, I'm afraid that what has happened is that our topic of today's discussion is not on the public agenda anymore. You don't hear about it in the State of the Union addresses, you don't hear about it in Congress. It's just not out there, and Oak Park still finds itself on the edge of a resegregated community, Austin, with all of its problems, and without too much attention being given to the future of towns like ours that are still hoping to maintain their situation in fairness to everybody, but facing demographic trends which are still worrisome. Interesting, I found in looking back that at the time that we got into this Delphi process, we were saying that the Chicago region was expecting 1.5 million more blacks moving into the region or growing here as in families than they had in 1970 and by the year 2000. Well, that was an overstatement. We know that many blacks did move to the suburbs. Many of them moved to other parts of the country. Birth rates on all categories of people have fallen, but still the numbers are very large in terms of the growth of any of the groups, including the black community. And so Oak Park still finds itself adjacent to an expanding black community, and so the housing market is going to be affected naturally that way. And so it strikes me that we have, on the one hand, I think, some success in the regional strategies. More towns do have open housing ordinances, more blacks are moving to more suburban communities, but at the same time, Oak Park still, its success is part of its problem. It has become so attractive that everybody wants to live here. And in a sense, a sad thing to say, one thing that keeps it strong is that the housing prices are so high that many people can't afford to live here. I tell some of my friends who complain about that we had a recent sale on housing in Oak Park. We dropped prices 20% over the last 2 or 3 years, and they should not complain. But in fact, relatively speaking, housing prices are high. That's a sign of health, but it's also a problem. So yeah, our housing condition is good. It's going to take constant effort to keep it that way. The village board has spent money in the past, and I think it's been well rewarded. And I hope the current and future boards continue with the same thought in mind, that they have a role to play in maintaining a strong housing stock.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we've neglected to really address here this afternoon, because we could obviously spend many hours discussing the challenges to Oak Park, but the kind of racial change that took place in Austin that Ron alluded to, it was devastating, and yet it was a slower process in Austin than in many other Chicago neighborhoods, because 18 blocks, if you take Madison Street, going from east to west, 18 blocks in a 5-year period went from all white to over 25% black. And in Austin, when a block went 25% black, it almost automatically went 100% black. And so what Oak Park was really confronted with in 1971 was that this kind of racial change on a block-by-block basis, accompanied by redlining, panic peddling by realtors where they would go and really fan the flames of fear and get whites to sell their houses, often at decreased values, to black families who moved in, believing they were moving into diverse neighborhoods. And I think when I was thinking about this last night, I thought, you know, it's really interesting that when blacks seek housing and whites seek housing, they're both seeking not to live in a neighborhood that's all one race, but to live in a diverse neighborhood, because they know that economically that kind of neighborhood tends to be a healthier neighborhood. So very seldom would a black walk into the housing center and say, I want to live in an all black section of Oak Park. I mean, we almost never heard this. But we would hear certainly whites come into the office and say, I want to move in a neighborhood that's diverse, but not too diverse. You know, and so we have to be very honest. I think the great thing about Oak Park is we've been able to discuss these things, you know, in an honest way. These are real human issues. And if whites feel uncomfortable moving into a neighborhood that's more than X% black, what does that really mean to Oak Park? And I pulled out a very interesting article last night. It was from 1998, I think. Oh, the eyes are so bad. But anyway, I think it's 1996. Okay.
98.
98, thank you. Okay, and this is the Chicago Reporter, a very, very legitimate and wonderful publication in Chicago, especially at that time. And in the article is Evanston and Oak Park struggle to keep racial balance, and it really deals with the census data in parts of Oak Park and parts of Evanston, showing maps that are more black residents than other sections of the community. And so even going back to that time, we have people saying, you know, like, is Oak Park going to be able to make it? Is Evanston going to be able to make it long-term as diverse communities? And so, you know, these are emotional issues, but they're economic issues. And so when you look at Austin, what did people experience? They saw the banks leave, they saw the churches leave, they saw the businesses leave. Almost overnight, the businesses changed from ethnic businesses along Madison Street to closed businesses. And when you experience that kind of economic devastation, it's not easy overnight to have Maya del Sol come into the neighborhood or to have any other viable business, restaurant come in and deal with a diverse population. Because now you have one racial group, and that racial group has less economic viability. They have less opportunity to go to a bank and ask for a loan to start a business. And so you end up with people looking at the neighborhood and saying, oh my gosh, we don't want this to happen here. And I'm going to turn to our banker for a minute on this one to maybe give a few reflections on what does happen when neighborhoods experience this kind of racial change and the economic effects. And let me say, Oak Park has not been protected from this, because if you look at some of our neighborhoods where we're trying to bring in new businesses, it is an issue. It is an issue we've had to deal with. So anyway.
Well, it's it's a delicate balance. It's almost like an ecosystem. I hadn't thought about it before coming back up here, but Bobbie and Larry and Louise have described Res Corp, housing development. You just described Louise's work as a volunteer with the building owners. And so from my standpoint as a banker, the economics are when you look to make a loan, you're doing appraisals. So you're looking at the surrounding area. And if you have a failure, and it was sold into a failure, then it was, just to use round numbers, $100,000 value, and there's an economic distress, and it gets sold at 60, and there's X number of units in it, and it looks just like the building next door to it. Well, guess what the value of the building next door to it is when that building owner wants to put in great new kitchens and upgrade the courtyard. Then the bank, me, is saying, well, when I get the appraisal, I don't see the same value. Maybe I don't get that loan. Maybe I'm not able to upgrade it. So you need a Res Corp. You need to be able to retain the values of those properties and pump them up and cause people to continue to want to pay rents that are market rents that will help that building owner retain that building, keep his values up, reinvest in that building, so that my house retains its value and I can go to Maya del Sol in my neighborhood. So it really is a ecosystem, and I would that deserves to be maintained to get the ultimate outcome that we all want, which is a healthy, diverse, attractive community to all parties. And I guess the other thought that I had on this is to give you a little bit more insight into the housing center, because that's what I was involved in. I hadn't thought about it, but Louise is doing work with the building owners and taking clients out and showing them apartments. And as a board member, you would get a turn doing that Saturdays, working the front desk, so you actually met the clients and you knew what we did. And that was actually fun. That's when you actually saw people coming into the community, not knowing the community, and looking to live here and being excited about the prospects of living here. You also saw the building owners excited about the prospects of renting their building and working with our volunteers to show their building. And that was a sort of a separate orbit from being a board member. To me, it was sort of a separate orbit from being a board member that was really more interested in helping us continue to promote our policies, but also finding board members with the energy and the passion and commitment to keep it going, to come after work, and before dinner, or miss the kids this or that, to actually spend time working on keeping this going. So I think the economics of it are critical, and I do think we've had a lot of success. I do know that we have at least one under 50 person, because I got my son to join. So I did follow your lead.
Good.
I did bring
That's great.
one person.
Well, we didn't say you had to, but you did it. One thing I did want to mention about a couple of our programs and how they got started. One thing that was great, and which I loved about being at the Housing Center, was our staff. And we would have staff meetings every week, and we would pose certain questions like, what do we do about this? And if I went to a meeting in someplace else in New York or someplace where we were tossing around ideas, I would come back and share them with the staff and say, well, how can we get people to look at these apartments? How can we change people's views? And out of those staff meetings came some really terrific ideas. And I'm just going to mention a few of them, but the Boulevard Run 10K, because a lot of people were reluctant to cross Austin Boulevard, we started a run which was actually became the top 10K run in the Chicago area, which the Housing Center initiated. And this run went. Our major sponsor was the bank, which
Yep.
of course changed names several times. It's now U.S. Bank at Madison and Austin, and the president of that bank, Mike Kelly, was very involved in the community, and so he sponsored, along with the hospital, West Suburban Hospital, this run. Well, what was so phenomenal about the run was we had 1,200 people running through Columbus Park, who prior to that time, nobody would even cross the boulevard and walk into the park, where I cross-country ski a lot, incidentally. But anyway, so we got people to run through Columbus Park, run through Austin, and we got them on Midway Park and Race Avenue, where there's some very beautiful homes. And as a result of that, then the next thing that happened was we started a house tour in Austin and got the bankers to come in, especially the bankers, the appraisers, to come in and tour the houses on Midway Park and Race Avenue, see how beautiful these houses were, and change their opinion about what they were going to give as a mortgage loan, so people could actually purchase some of these houses and fix them up. And so a lot of these ideas came out of the creativity of our staff. And I just want to mention two other things and then open it up to the audience. And that is, Louise mentioned the fact that we would give listings to clients. And in the beginning, we would just give them a sheet with listings on, and then Louise might call the client the next week and say, did you go to see this apartment on Humphrey or on Washington or Austin Boulevard? And the client would say, well, no, I didn't go to see it. Louise would say, well, why didn't you go to see it? Well, I was just told, shouldn't look in that part of town. And so we decided to try something new, which was over a summer we hired somebody who was a graduate student to actually do what realtors do, and that was to escort people to the apartments so we would be sure that they would get to see the apartment listings that we had given them. And it didn't work, and it was a huge flop. We finished the whole summer, and nobody had rented any of these apartments, and the graduate student went back to school, and we were ready to scrap the idea when a delegation of apartment building owners came to the office, and they said, we really like that idea that you had, and we want you to continue it. And I said, but it didn't work. We didn't get any results out of it. And the owner said, well, yeah, it didn't work, but we think it can work. Would you be willing to continue to try it for a little bit while longer? And that initiated our escorting program, which we still do today. And it really gives an opportunity for some of our escorts or local residents to throw somebody in the car and say to them, this is where I live, and look at the businesses here, and look at the beautiful homes. And suddenly they're seeing that East Oak Park is just as beautiful, if not more beautiful in certain areas than elsewhere in the community. And the other thing I wanted to mention was our apartment preview program, because Louise mentioned that a lot of these apartments were in pretty bad condition. And the clients would come back to us and say, how could you send me to that building? I mean, I got there and the halls were dirty, and oh my gosh, the kitchen looks like something out of the 1920s, and the old refrigerator. And so then we thought, my gosh, well, we're not actually going to see these apartments. And we started our preview program where we sent people out, and that gave us a chance to say to the building owners, you really have to improve your buildings, and this is what we want you to do. So, these are just two of maybe, I don't want to say 100 different ideas that were initiated, but the Housing Center became a think tank for all of this kind of creative thinking that still goes on today. So now's the time for us to answer your difficult questions or for you to make comments.
And I will carry a microphone. Does anyone here have comment?
David Bollinger. See, I'm going to know most of the names here.
Some of you may know there's been recent comments came from one of our village trustees. There's been an initiative by the community of congregations regarding outreach to Austin again. And the things you just mentioned were examples kind of that. I'm curious what you think should happen in that area, might happen, in order to improve that relationship and the knowledge of Austin?
Well, needless to say, this is something we did continuously for 40 years, and even before the Housing Center started, when Oak Park was developing all these programs, we worked, pretty closely with OBA, which was Organization for a Better Austin, and some of the groups there, the Austin Shock Historical Association and others. So I see nothing, how can anything bad come out of talking to your neighbors? It seems to me like a great thing to rekindle.
But any new ideas about that?
Well, did you want to say something,
Well,
Ryan?
no, I didn't have the new ideas part
But,
of the
this
answer
is
for
more about,
David. But I do think the outreach and the engagement is important, because particularly if you can get members of the community there to really kind of take ownership in their own stake, and then learn and collaborate with us, I just think that's hugely positive.
Yeah, and I think right now with the North Avenue activities that are going on North Avenue, the Oak Park side and the Chicago side are working very closely together on things like, we don't want a pawn shop, and we don't want, businesses that our kids can't go into, like the smoke shop, which is gone, I guess. But so both sides of the street were working on that on North Avenue. Louise?
We also do carry a few listings that are in Austin, and we have for some time. It's a small percentage out of the listings, but they are with owners that we work with mostly for a very long time, but we do carry those listings. And we also have a wonderful staff member who has lived in Austin for a long time, and is able to talk very well about his community to people to us, and to people in the office who come in to look for apartments, and show that they're intimidated by that area, and can attest to the fact that he's very happy living where he is, and has been for some time. And then we have other listings there in that neighborhood that we can offer to people who are looking for things in that size and price range.
Trustevant?
Yes.
This is kind of a statement that has implicit questions in it. The study that just came out about, surprise, surprise, racism in Oak Park, still. And to me, part of the success of the housing center is that when people think Oak Park and housing, they think of the housing center. The disadvantage of that, as I learned in the diversity task force in 2000, is our housing is much more complicated than that, and I think Ron referred to it. The housing center is self-selecting. If people go there, they go by choice. Mm-hmm. Many people find apartments in Oak Park without the housing center. Right. The housing center only does rental. It does not do sales. The housing center, as my understanding, only works with apartment owners who are willing to work with them. So we forget that there are apartment owners out there and apartment buildings that do not use the housing center. And we forget that there are apartment owners and homeowners who are not in favor of racial integration. So I'm glad, now that our village president is here, I'm glad it was the village who did the study.
Well, I think there are a couple important things here, Bob, and that is, we did experience over the years, and I'm not telling any secrets on this one, there were building owners who would list their apartments with us in East Oak Park. And they also owned buildings in West Oak Park. And they would not, we couldn't force them. You can't force people to work cooperatively with you. And they would not list those apartments in West Oak Park. So they would sort of, they wanted the best of both worlds. They wanted to keep the apartment buildings in West Oak Park all white, let's say, although that really today is not the case for the most part. Most buildings in Oak Park that are still rental buildings do have some extent of diversity. But there were definitely owners who wanted to play the game both ways. And there have always been owners who refused, and I see Sandra there, Sandra Sokol. There were always owners who refused to work with the housing center and were very uncooperative in working with the village. So anytime, I mean, I think what we have to say about Oak Park, yeah, I mean, huge success, wonderful place. We are all thrilled with the success. Perfection? No. You know, there is no place on earth where you get everything you want all the time. And so, as Larry said, we have to constantly revisit this issue. And so, yeah, I mean, you're right. Not all owners and not all apartment seekers. But I do want to say this. When an apartment seeker comes back to one of our counselors and says, wow, I tried to see this apartment. This is a white or a black client or any other racial group. I tried to see this apartment and this person wouldn't show it to me, or I couldn't reach them or whatever. Our job always was to pick up the phone and call that owner, call that manager and say, this person is trying to see this apartment and you have not made it available to them. Or to go to the village, even back when Chris Rano was there, Sherlyn Reed was there, and say, we have a case of discrimination here. How can we mediate this? How can we handle it? So, I mean, all of this is not new, but I think that we have to congratulate ourselves a little bit for doing most of the things right most of the time, but not all the time. Was Sandra, were you going to say? Oh, Jerry.
Hi, my name is Jerry Delaney. Anon, I see you're here, so you may be the more appropriate person to address this to. I was somewhat startled and very sad to see the headline in the Wednesday Journal that came through the email yesterday that, and at the same time pleased that the test for racial discrimination had been done by my village. And I congratulate the village on that. But what I'd like to know is a little bit of the background. What has been happening? Why did that cause the village to do that? And if you can give just a little more information about it. I don't know.
President Anon, are you willing to address it?
It's our village president.
Village president.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to pass the phone over because they have much more experience than I do. I'd like to find out more, and this is why I'm here today, because I'm disappointed with the report. And I hope that we can continue the work that we began. Thank you.
Good, thank you. We got Sandra.
Sandra Sokol.
Thank you.
Hi, Sandra Sokol, resident.
Former village clerk.
Former village clerk. Former representative of the Community Relations Department for the Village of Oak Park. Former volunteer for the Housing Center and community activist who got involved in housing the second we moved to Oak Park in 1972 and still passionately care about the issue. I really was not going to talk, but based on what I'm hearing, what we're missing is what has happened over the years regarding village involvement. And when I was hired to work as a community representative in 1985, I believe, there was a director, there were 3 community representatives, and a secretary, we don't call people that anymore, and a clerk typist, we certainly don't call people that anymore. And at this very moment, there is one person who is the director of community relations. Over the years, for whatever reason, our elected officials and the village managers decided that these issues were really not high on the plate, and there were other things that were important. So I don't want to go into all of the things that have happened, but the Housing Center is great. 4 representatives up there have devoted much of their time. We have Galen, a former trustee. We have Mark Lesoff, a former trustee. These folks were interested in the importance of fair housing and diversity in this community. So, as many of you in this room really are, so the report, and I don't know why the village did it, but yes, it's good. It's unfortunate that we have another person who wants to talk. I don't mean to really go on and on, but it's an issue that you always must stay on top of it, just like crime, just like the condition of our housing stock, and that's a whole other topic. So this is a good thing to continue talking and caring about the issue, and I'm going to turn this over to...
I just want to add that I'm Simone Boutet, I'm the Assistant Village Attorney. I'm not talking loud enough? Oh. No, I just want to answer the question. I believe that the reason that they commissioned the study was because it was part of the analysis to impediments of fair housing that the village studied. I think they completed it about 2 years ago, maybe, and I believe this was a follow-up as one of the recommendations that the village undertake this study. And of course, like everybody in this room, it's extremely disappointing. It's a very, very alarming report. And I really think one of the topics that we need to discuss isn't so much just our history, but what are we going to do about this now? And should it be the role of the housing authority? Should it be the role of the village? Or what should those shared roles be? Certainly, the first thing that struck me was that obviously we're not getting those building owners into some kind of an education program that teaches them their legal requirements. If nothing else. I mean,
Well, the Housing Center, I believe, just had last week another seminar for owners and managers, and this has been something that's been going on for like 35 years. But, as we've stated, they're not forced to go to these meetings. They don't all go to these meetings, and so you're always going to have some people who fall through the cracks on this. I mean, hopefully we will all be discussing at a future time this report, because I think everybody sitting at this table, we could all respond to it, but don't have enough time to do so today. I guess off the top of my head, I would only make a couple of comments, and that is, as a sociologist and a professional in the field, I would look at a much larger sample. I would need to look at the methodology of the study. I would need to look at how the listings were chosen, where they were chosen from. There would be a lot of questions. I have more questions than answers on this one, and so I can't really engage in any meaningful, intelligent discussion about it until I have answers to some of those questions. But I can certainly say from the Housing Center standpoint, when I was there, and what I know of what the Housing Center does today, the Housing Center would never accept discrimination on a widespread basis. However, and I think we have to talk a lot about how far is the community willing to go to maintain diversity in locations that are in need of white demand in order to remain integrated. And so what I would say to you, and this is a tough question, I can't answer it. I mean, I can only say personally, if my mother came to the Housing Center, I would have encouraged her to make a move that was consistent with racial diversity in this village. And I did the same myself when I purchased a home. You know, we can do what we can on our own. But look, if you have a block, I mean, this is a question, this is an answer. But let's say you have a block that's 80% black, and you have some apartment buildings that are 100% black, and next to them are some buildings that you can try to keep diverse by encouraging whites to move into those buildings. I have never talked to any black friend of mine or black who is involved in this village who has said you shouldn't make a really big effort to get whites into those buildings and keep those buildings integrated. But if you're going to do that, how far are you willing to go? What are you willing to do? What are you willing to say? And what are you willing to implement? And I think the the big question that hangs over all of us in this room, and certainly everybody at this table, because we've had to ask ourselves this question over and over again. I know Louise and every staff member at the Housing Center, every staff member at Village Hall had to ask themselves the question, how far do you go to achieve diversity? And it may be in the process, it just may be in the process that somebody is bypassed for another person to achieve diversity. Are you willing to do that? How are you willing to just sacrifice a whole section of Oak Park and say that section of Oak Park is going to be all black, but it's going to end at Ridgeland, or it's going to end at this street? Because I hate to tell you this, that never happens. It never happens where you set a boundary, and that boundary is where racial change ends. And I see Galen nodding his head, and we should probably hear from Galen on this. But this is it. This is it.
Very short speech. We did live through the process of racial change in Chicago. We lived in the Avalon Park neighborhood before moving here. The problem with white people was not that they were leaving. The problem was that they wouldn't move in. It was as simple as that. All of a sudden you woke up one day and found out that there were no whites looking for housing in that neighborhood. And so I guess we can have different points of view regarding that, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. There was certainly pent-up demand on the part of black families for good housing. There's no doubt about that. And from that point of view, maybe complete racial change was not the negative that we all think it might have been. The pent-up demand for good single-family housing on the part of African-American families was very strong. And that's why all of a sudden the realtors were not, they were showing houses disproportionately to African-American families because that's what the demand was. The demand was not on the part of white families.
Well, all over the United States, when we got started working on this in the 70s, what we heard over and over and over again is exactly what Galen just said. And that was the loss of white demand. And so, you know, if you realize that and you understand as a sociologist that white demand is what determines the future of the neighborhood in terms of being a diverse neighborhood, white demand is what it's all about in that case. Now, black demand, you have to be sure, it's a tough issue. You've got to be sure that black demand is satisfied in the sense that housing is found by blacks looking for housing. But if blacks are being steered to Humphrey Avenue and not being shown housing throughout the community, here's Ronnie Atkins, an intelligent, well-educated guy with a wife equally intelligent and well-educated, and yet they didn't even probably sense at the time that they were being steered to a house on Humphrey Avenue that steering was taking place. And so this is such a complicated issue because why would Oak Park have such huge demand from blacks when we have hundreds of suburbs in DuPage County and elsewhere that are overwhelmingly white? And I might add that the agency that did the testing for this recently released study, Hope Fair Housing, operates in an area where there's been, unfortunately, very little impact by fair housing agencies in getting black housing seekers to actually be exposed to the full range of housing options in the area, even though they've tried very hard. So, I mean, an agency was hired to do this research that in fact has had a hard time in their own area opening housing. So, you know, this is what you've said is so true. And the Housing Center, when it first started, did and still today does make special efforts to continue white demand in the community with the recognition that without white demand for housing, we resegregate. Did you want to say anything, Ron?
Well, no, I was just going to acknowledge what Gail said there. That's absolutely true. I did sell that house on Humphrey, And I won't bore you with the stories I had from would-be buyers of the house, but it was difficult to nil to attract white demand to purchase the house. So your question, Bobbie, is a really pressing question. What are you willing to do? Because you really need to create that demand.
Yes, one of you had a question.
Both of them.
Both of you had a question.
Hi, I'm Daniel Johnson, and I moved here about a year and a half ago, and I made use of the housing center. Louise was my intake counselor, and I had a very, very good experience. I lived for a year in the Arts District on Harrison, and then I was so happy that I found a larger apartment last summer on Maple Street, and in the meantime, I've married my partner from the long-time relationship from back east, and he's recently relocated to Oak Park, and we're very happy here. One of the reasons that I was attracted was because it was such a simpatico place for artists to live. I'm a performing artist, and so that was my prime attraction. The other thing was the Oak Park's reputation for being diversity friendly, because I'm a mixed race couple partner here, and just so happens that David is a former housing counselor, and so he might have some insights into, although he's a newcomer, I think he may have some interesting observations.
Well, first of all,
Stand up, Mike.
okay. As I have been already introduced, my name is David Stevens. I am a brand new, freshly minted Oak Parker as of January 13th. Thank you. I'm a former resident of the Newark, New Jersey area. I've lived there pretty much for all the first 55 years of my life, and I just moved here now. Namely for this one, but that's another story. I find, and I've been a former housing counselor, I've worked with the Urban League, the NAACP, several community development groups, I was briefly a mortgage banker, and now I work for the federal government. I find Oak Park a truly fascinating community because where I came from, to give you an idea, I lived through the '68 riots. And I saw my community from June when I left school to September just totally go all black. And the area has never changed since then. New Jersey and that area generally has income and racial stratification except in certain areas, certain communities. I won't give you names because they won't mean anything here. But some of them tend to be like Evanston and here Oak Park, but the majority are like Austin, etc., or other exurban, suburban areas. And what I find unique about Oak Park is it seems like from the beginning you had skin in the game and you decided that, you made a stand. And I find that both refreshing and upsetting that other communities couldn't do the same thing, that there really wasn't enough care and concern. It's not what drove me to become a housing counselor for all those years that I did it, but I found that over the years there's a lot of education needed, not just for homeowners and renters, but for people who deal with these, the banks, the landlords, all this education, and more importantly, they have to have economic incentives, desire to improve not just the community, but themselves. And I just hope that you're able to continue this. And maybe after I get a little more settled in, I wouldn't mind being a part of it, but the fact is, I'm so appreciative of the fact that my partner chose this community as our first home here in the area. And right now I can't think of a whole lot better community to be with. And I knew it was the right community because about a year ago when I made my first visit, I opened up the local newspaper and there was a column that said, hey, you like the Oak Park way of life? It costs money, deal with it. That's a refreshing point of view because everybody wants the benefits but they don't want the tax. Well, I'm sorry, it costs. And if it's a town that's proud enough to face that and deal with it and offer it and do everything, I say hats off to all of you. Very good, very well, good job done.
Thank you. It's interesting. I was just going to make one comment about New Jersey. One of the there were two communities that were involved in the Oak Park Exchange Congress. And may I say, the Oak Park Exchange Congress, for many of the people in this room who participated in it, was a phenomenal experience. Willingboro, New Jersey, and Teaneck, New Jersey were both involved. The sad and tragic thing is many of these communities did not have the resources that Oak Park had. For example, I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright architecture, the historical kind of background. It's not just about the housing center. It's about all of these other, the richness of the history of this community. Hemingway and the Hemingway collection at the library. Look at our library building. I mean, we were willing to spend this kind of money to have a gorgeous library in this community. But, you know, it is sad, it is tragic, because many of the communities that came to us in the 70s and 80s, I'm thinking Bellwood, I'm thinking Hillside, many of these communities that came to us started too late and did too little. And the commitment that we made and continue to make to diversity, in no way in my mind is it decimated, destroyed, or really negatively impacted by the study that was done. Because it is easy to do studies that show almost anything in our society. Doing a really good study that really has broad-reaching implications with maybe hundreds of testers rather than a small number, done in the proper way, you know, is maybe a way to go. But the fact is, our success speaks for itself in many ways, and also the lack of success in some areas. And so people like you become very important. I hope you will volunteer or work at the Housing Center, because you obviously have a real richness of background to bring to the community. Yes, there's a comment back here.
I think this should be the last one, and
Okay.
we'll wrap this up.
Yeah, it's just great discussion.
It is. I agree, it is a great discussion. I'd just like to say, and I'm a little nervous, I hope this...
It's on this, we have a dead battery.
Here's
I'll
this
just
one's
speak loud.
fine.
I'll speak loud.
Take this one. Take this one, Debbie. Well, we can hear you anyway. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm trying to say is that I do recall, for instance, seeing someone being interviewed from Oak Park area, and their premise was at that time about diversity was kind of like what the gentleman on the panel said, that Oak Park kind of views it as if you can afford to live here, then, you know, it was implied that, you know, that you were the type of individuals that the community would like to have as part of the community. So I remember thinking to myself, then it seems as though we're talking about like culture, you know, maintaining the culture of the town. So when I think about that, and I'm thinking about what you're saying, which hadn't occurred to me, that there were areas where there were primarily blacks living in, and there was a problem of getting whites to move to that area, you know, my thought then became, well, if there was the thought of the money being the type of individuals that you want in the community, then why would someone have a problem with living amongst blacks if they were white, for instance, if the culture deemed what was hoped it would be. So I guess my only point is, how do you control culture? I mean, how do you, in choosing an individual to move into the area, how do you determine that individual has the culture or the ideas of the Oak Park community? And I say that only because in assimilating into Oak Park, you know, a lot of things that a lot of my opinions have changed since moving here. But
if I just moved here, you wouldn't have a clue as to whether my mind would change or not. So, you know, in my mind, your dilemma is, well, is he our type of individual? And then it goes down to, well, if he can afford it, then, you know, it's possible that he is, but maybe he's not. So, you know, that's like a dilemma that I'm glad is not on my shoulders, because it seems to be a difficult one, but, you know, I just wanted to voice that particular point of view.
I love your statement. Yeah, Ron, but let me just say one thing. I love your statement, because I am looking at my grandson who goes to school now in 3rd grade here, and I think that the kids in school have solved a lot of these problems, because the 3rd graders in my grandson's classroom, it's like the United Nations, every race and every background of kid, and they are creating a new Oak Park. And I think really, unfortunately, whites have a lot of baggage about their comfort level in going into certain buildings and areas, and we have to just help them, in a sense, get beyond that. And blacks have a lot of feelings about comfort level and what is comfortable. Unfortunately, or fortunately, 3rd graders seem to do better than we do. So, Ron.
I know we're trying to wrap up, but one of the things that Louise said was that we, at the Housing Center, we give you literature, and we give you literature that tell you what our purpose and what our policies are. So we're a lot like the rest of the community. I don't know that we try and determine whether you fit or not, but we tell you what we're about. And actually the community is like that. Oak Park is one of those, I mean, you can get a caucus on almost anything in Oak Park, because and they're willing to debate anything, and debate it, and debate it, and debate it. So if you're looking for homogeneity, same, Oak Park ain't it. So you'll, in my mind, if you're looking for only this certain type, white, black, short, fat, if you're only looking for this certain type, you won't like it here. It's not that kind of town.
How's River Forest?
River Forest is a lot like, I moved to River Forest. So and when I moved to River Forest, I'll make this real quick. I was telling my wife was telling me, we have to move. I need a bigger house. I need a bigger house. And I was like, oh man, I just cannot believe this. I don't want to move. And then she moved me to River Forest, and I was like, how many black people are there? I want the census count. I mean, what's this going to be like? And that's where Bobbie's point comes in, because I mean, I spend my day at work. I'm working all day, but the community is great because the kids are great, and the kids don't see color. They see a friend, somebody to play with, somebody to play music with. They see an opportunity to be open, and that's what happens really at the high school. If you go to that high school. I went to speak to that high school one day, and I was like, wow, that thing is amazing. That really is the UN.
Oh, yeah.
So anyway.
I think, Larry, did you?
One last comment.
We have a lot of last.
Pondering all that we've heard, for a period of time here, I've been stuck with the image of Bobbie pushing her way into somebody's house. I don't see how she could ever do that. But
I'm pushy.
Thinking of the what to do next. I'm impressed, as I'm sure many are, by our new village president and board working on the subject of how do we promote more economic development in the community, thereby reorganizing the Oak Park Development Corporation, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it seems to me that in terms of white demand and getting that to apply throughout the whole village, the village could again play a role in helping to market. We have, on the one hand, a wonderful advantage that we didn't have 40 years ago. Today, Oak Park is recognized nationally as an outstanding community, has all the attractions, it's walkable, it's environmentally wonderful, it's got transportation and schools, etc. But somehow that message doesn't seem to apply to the east side of the village or some other segments of the village. And it strikes me that this is a marketing challenge, and that perhaps the village could look not only at how do we get more businesses to Oak Park, but how do we get more equal demand for housing in all parts of Oak Park as a marketing challenge.
Well, that's a good note to finish on.
Well, I welcome that idea, and I welcome working with all the people who will be coming and demanding apartments in East Oak Park. We want to work with them. No, we do get people who want to live there, and we're happy to give information about the whole community. And it is a very rewarding job to meet all the lovely people who come in and to see the results. If we could only get now more people to tell us where they finally settle. That's always been one of the tough things. Our world is getting a little more cagey about giving out information that way, and we love to hear from anybody who does make a move in Oak Park. We please. But when we see the results, we're so happy.
Well, let's give all of ourselves a pat on the back because we've all done it.
Yes.